Hi, today's lesson is double seat stitch, and this will be for your 7th block of your 9-block Afghan. Double seat stitch is reversible, that is both sides are exactly the same, and sometimes you will see this written as moss stitch, but this pattern came from 750 knitting stitches, and they call it double seat stitch in that book. Now, I had to change the pattern in 2 ways. So that's why today's lesson is going to focus on what to do if you see a pattern and it has what's called a balancing stitch. So we know that we only have 12 stitches to work with for our inset, and we have 24 rows top to bottom. Now this pattern is written for a multiple of 2 plus 1 stitches, which would mean normally you would put on an odd number of stitches. Well, that's entirely possible if you're knitting a whole Afghan and you just change your stitch count accordingly. But we're limited because all of our panels, our blocks, have to be the same size. And we can't use, the stitches need to be the same number. So before you change a pattern like that, or in the process of working with a pattern like that, you might want to just transpose it for your rods, but knit it as it's written. So I wanted to see how that would look. I put on my 11 stitches, an odd number of stitches. I transposed it to the rods, but I knit it with the balancing stitch. And when I did that, you can see that the first row is my cast on row, but then just above that I have 2 V's, 2 bars, 2 V's, 2 bars, 2 V's, and so on across the row. Now that means that that balancing stitch, which you can see visually on the sample and you can see in the pattern as well, means that immediately the double seat stitch begins. So let's get the I've written all this out in bigger writing here because this book is so tiny, but so when we're going to transpose a pattern like this, so you're looking for a pattern, as I was when I wanted to create the 9-block Afghan. First of all, it will have, the name of the stitch, and it will tell you the multiple. And if it says something like this, multiple of 2 plus 1, that'll tell you that that includes a balancing stitch. And then, of course, that would mean that that has to be worked over an odd number of stitches. And they will write the pattern in such a way. So row 1 was a knit 1, and you'll see this asterisk. And then it'll tell me purl 1, knit 1, repeat from the asterisk to the end. And the next row begins with a P, then there's an asterisk, and I knit 1, purl 1, and repeat to the end. And row 3, they told me to repeat row 2, and row 4, repeat row 1. And to repeat those 4 rows for the pattern. Well, that's also a good indicator that those first stitches are just balancing stitches. So what I like to do when I'm transposing a pattern then for straight knitting needles, which is what this is, to the rods, I like to write the whole thing out because I know that I'm going to be reversing my even number rows, and it's easier for me to do that if I can see the whole thing written out. So do that first as your step 1, instead of having this as row 2 and as row 1, because you're going to be changing those even number rows. So once you've written it all out, then you can reverse the even number rows. So instead of purling on row 2 for my first stitch, I would knit 1, then there'd be an asterisk, knit 1, purl 1, and once I've reversed it, it will be asterisk, purl 1, knit 1. And of course I leave row 3 the same, and then row 4 I reverse the stitch. So if it tells me knit 1, I'm going to purl 1, asterisk, purl 1, knit 1, I'm going to asterisk, knit 1, purl 1. So in other words, reversing those. Now, of course, knits and purls are terminology for straight knitting needles, so it might be helpful for you if you are not a knitter to just go ahead and change those K's and P's to F's and B's, and that's what I do next when I change it to the rods. So now I'm going to write it out just as it would appear, in the body of my description when I write it for you. So I just change those to F's and B's and so on. Now, just like in the sample, I can see, once I write that out, that if I leave this with the odd number of stitches and keep the balancing stitch, that what happens is at the end of row 1, I front stitch, and at the beginning of row 2, I front stitch. So in other words, my stitches are going to line up from row 1 to 2. And when I knit row 3, I'm going to end with a front stitch from row 2, and I'm going to begin row 3 with a back stitch. So when I knit row 3, I'll be doing the opposite stitch when they're on top of each other. And when I knit row 4, I will be beginning with the back stitch, and that will be right on top of the back stitch from row 3 I ended with. So these two rows line up. You could say, well, those are the same stitch. But when I work row 3, I'm going to be doing the opposite. So that gives me my blocks of double seed stitch. Now, what happens if I just want to take off that balancing stitch so that I have an even number of stitches to work with? What happens to my pattern? Well, just try it, cross it out, and knit it and look at, even before you knit it, you can see that if I just eliminate those balancing stitches, the first one at the beginning of each row, when I knit row 1, I'm going to end with a front, and row 2, I'm going to begin with a back. In other words, I'm going to knit the opposite when I go from 1 to 2. When I knit row 3, I'm going to begin with a front. Where I ended with a front, I'll be knitting the same. And when I knit row 4, I'm going to be front stitching where a back stitch was. So you can think of it as opposite same if you want to think of it that way. But by doing that, I'll still be stacking my stitches, but it will be starting with half of the double seed stitch, if you know what I mean. And so instead of, as in this pattern, where I immediately begin with the double seed stitch, I'm going to be having that. But in this case, when you see the whole thing and you see it within the ground of the garter stitch, again, let me put this back up here, Joe. I'll have to move the camera. When I put this, when I do my sample, let's say you just want to see how that's going to look like, because remember, it's surrounded in this case by garter stitch. So try putting on to your rods, 6 or 8 stitches. In other words, you want to see what it's going to look like by knitting a little sample and do a couple rows of garter stitch. And that's what I did for this case. I did a couple rows of garter stitch. I knit 6 stitches across. I ended with a couple stitches of garter stitch. I put garter stitch on the edges for my little sample. And I saw that that was going to be perfectly acceptable, even though it's not perfect, in my humble opinion. So that is how you transpose a pattern for straight knitting needles to rods when it includes a balancing stitch. And I hope that's helpful as you plan your own projects in the future. Thanks for watching.